everyone. My name is Jim Ryan. I'm the Director of Research and the Director of the Middle East Program here at FPRI. And I am glad to be welcoming you all here today for an event on transactionalism in U.S. foreign policy, which is part of our national security program. And I'm here to just sort of kick things off and welcome you all. And then I'm going to turn things over to the head of our national security program in just a minute. This event is really about, I think, an issue that has been gaining in prominence as a sort of subject of foreign policy and national security analysis over the last couple of years. How does the United States leverage its financial position, leverage its resources, and leverage its diplomatic relationships to attain its goals, whether it's with regards to competition with China or countering Russia's invasion of Ukraine or affecting sustainable development across the world. We have a couple of really excellent and thought-provoking analysts and scholars with us to discuss these issues. And I just want to say that I'm very, very excited to see this conversation. It's something that's been ongoing offline for quite a while. Just one final note, I do want to say, these events that we put on are free to you, but not free to us. So if you enjoy them, if you find this edifying, we do thank you for your support. If you're already a supporter of FPRI, if you're a board member, or if you're a member or supporter through our website, thank you very much. You make this possible. And if you're not, please, take a look in the chat. You're going to find some links to how you might be able to get involved or support the work that we're doing going forward. So without any further ado, I am going to hand things over to Nick Gvosdev, who is the head of our national security program here at FPRI. He's also the editor of Orbis, our quarterly journal, and a professor at the Naval War College in Rhode Island, longtime friend of the program here. So Nick, why don't you take it away and introduce our speakers, and then we'll get the conversation started.
No, very happy that you're all joining us today, and happy to have my colleagues from FPRI, Karthik Sankaran and Maximilian Hess. We're uploading the full biographical sketches into the chat so that you can get if you didn't already derive it from the invitation, get a better sense of their backgrounds. But I'd like to just develop a bit more about something Jim said, the genesis of this event, which was a series of back and forth exchanges offline, or at least non-public, about these questions, about transactionalism, which generally has had in the past a negative connotation, that policy ought to be conducted on the basis of values and of commitment to principles, and transactionalism sounds mercenary. It sounds as if you're engaged in bargaining back and forth to achieve your ends. But we wanted to get at sort of the deeper questions behind this question of transactionalism in U.S. foreign policy, but also in the foreign policies of other countries. We noted that the term, the transactional 25, has been used to describe a series of middle powers, largely, but not exclusively, in the global South, that tend to look at U.S.-China competition, the question of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and other such issues in terms of how do they best secure their own national interests as they define them. And that often means continuing to do business, engaging or not engaging in sanctions, engaging or not engaging in trade, across these different countries and blocks and issues. And we wanted to get a bit more of a handle on that, as well as how this is playing out, again, here in the United States, where over the last number of years, there has been a new emphasis on projecting U.S. global engagement in the world as, of necessity, producing real-time value for Americans. And so the embrace of this slogan of a foreign policy for the middle class, the idea that U.S. engagement in the world should bring tangible, concrete benefits to Americans, to American businesses, to American workers, also has a bit of a transactional flavor to it. So we wanted to have this conversation today. I'm going to turn it over to Karthik and to Max to start off with some opening comments just on this broader theme to try to draw at some of these issues. We'll discuss among ourselves and then open it up for the audience to also engage. At any time, you can submit questions through the Q&A or chat boxes in the webinar, and we'll start to collate and collect those questions and comments so that they are available. So certainly feel free to take part in the conversation. If you're on social media and would like to tag FPRI, at FPRI for Twitter, for Blue Sky, or for any of the other platforms, that's a way also to continue the conversation beyond the hour or so that we'll have today. Karthik, I thought maybe I would turn to you as one of the ones who really got this conversation among the FPRI scholarly community going about 2 months ago about this question of transactionalism, and also the piece that you did for FPRI, looking at how the U.S. companies are lining up on the issue of trade with China and the typology that you came up with in terms of the different sort of ways of thinking about doing business with China, which I think was very useful for many readers. So, but to turn the floor over to you first and to start us off on this conversation.
Thanks very much, and thanks for having me. An absolute pleasure. Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things that set me off was this business exactly of the transactional 25, when it referred to countries as being ruthlessly pragmatic, in pursuit of their own interests in development, which led to those stances of kind of equidistance or something approaching it, either on U.S. China or on Russia Ukraine, and sometimes on both. And part of me went, this term is kind of memory holding at least 1,000 years of diplomatic history, going back to the time when the Fourth Crusade ended up in Constantinople instead of making it the Middle East, because my sense is that's how countries have always behaved. So it has this kind of normative tinge. Oh, that's something other people do. We don't do that. But scholars of diplomatic history know or history in general, no, that's simply not true. The other thing that I've kind of said is that when you hear someone from the State Department say values and interests, it really means values and or interests, and ticking one of those boxes is usually enough. And it's not just, I mean, pretty much every country operates that way. So once we recognize that, at least we have some grounding. But there are a couple of complexities here. One is that I think the term, even before this transactional 25, gained an additional resonance during the Trump administration, when it was feared that the transactionalism was not happening at an institutional and national level, but kind of at the level of the interests, of the purported interests of the first family. A lot of accusations flying around to that effect. I would note here that, for instance, there was this argument that the nature of the engagement with the Gulf Cooperation Council was driven to some degree by personal interests within the family. But I would also note that the Abraham Accords have now carried over and are now part of the Biden era foreign policy. So for all those accusations, there's some continuity over there. But I think what bothered people about that was that A, was personal, and B, a sense that this transactionalism that was allegedly being engaged in was a series, was basically treating relationships as one-off games, rather than as repeat games in which you try to kind of establish credibility through predictability. And there was some concern that by being overtly transactional, saying, okay, we're going to do this because this helps us, but we might not do this the next time around, it weakens credibility, even if that credibility is grounded in transactionalism. But the other issue here that I think is important, that's kind of what I tried to get to in the piece on the different corporate interests, is that it's also, we speak about the national interest, but we also know from history in general that nation states are not black boxes. Their conception of the national interest emerges from a set of negotiations of sectoral interests that happen within them, and whatever the interests are of a particular coalition, well, at that moment, are likely to be seen as the national interest. And one of my one-liners about this is, if given the way American industrial geography and American political geography intersect, if foreign policy for the middle class is basically a foreign policy for the upper Midwest and Western Pennsylvania, or at least in in good part. So I think when you kind of think of transactionalism, you have to think about transactionalism across borders, but also transactions that occur within borders, politics, to arrive at a fuller understanding of this. And then as for, just the different factions and how this played out in terms of U.S. foreign policy and U.S. economic policy and trade, for the piece I wrote, I did for FPRI, I said there are four broad factions on trade policy in the U.S. There are openers, who are the people who just want to open up other countries. They might object to IP theft or things like that, but the idea is we want to be in there. We are good enough to be in there. And that's a constituency that I think you'd find primarily in technology, certainly on Wall Street. But it is, I think, a lot, probably aerospace, but it's certainly a significant component of U.S. corporate interests, because we're at a stage where something like 40% of S&P 500 revenue comes from outside the U.S. So there is this sense that we need to be in there, and not just because we have markets, but some of these markets, even China, for instance, right now, this is not your typical emerging market in many sectors, particularly if you consider kind of battery technology and EVs and things like that. China is a market that defines the frontier. So you have to be there to be globally competitive. And that's an argument that we see. We see an argument from chip makers that we need to be there because this is the largest market for chips and so on. So that's one set of people whose views on transactionalism have to be taken into account in the context of domestic political transactionalism. Another group is what I call the decouplers. That's mostly in the national security community, who worry about China. They're like, okay, we need to decouple from China because our engagement there is enabling their rise as a peer competitor. Corporations might not feel that way, but significant portions of the national security and the political community do. There's a third set that I call the repatriationists. And those are the people, so whereas the decouplers are fine with friendshoring. Okay, we won't put it in China, we'll put it in Vietnam, we'll put it in Mexico, we'll put it in India. The repatriationists, which is more kind of a labor-oriented constituency, is that all these jobs belong here. We really shouldn't be sending them anywhere, which potentially impacts the ability of the U.S. to do a transactional foreign policy by promising friendshoring, because you have this opposition that comes from the repatriationists. And you've seen this in what most people concede would be a relatively benign outcome of Nippon Steel taking over U.S. Steel. But John Fetterman's like, no way, no how. And the fourth group are, what I call the derailers, who want to go beyond decoupling, but actually to kind of throw China off the path of potential convergence or peer competitors. And I think, they certainly have people who object, not just in the US, in the corporate community. They might have very enthusiastic proponents in the security community and other portions of and parts of Congress, but derailing China, derailing the world's second largest economy, has a profound impact on U.S. relationships, because China is the world's second largest economy. It's the world's largest importer of commodities. So when you think about transactionalism, you just have to balance all these different points of view. So I think that's part of the complexity of of transactionalism generally.
Yeah, I mean, so then that raises some very interesting points, and then to turn it over to you, Max, is that is it just simply a matter of dollars and cents? Is it just simply a matter of reaching foreign policy as reaching a series of contracts? Or do these other things that we are discussing, non-tangible, perhaps imperatives, values, systems, laws, how does that play out? How does this play out in terms of the tension we have certainly in U.S. Domestic politics, but also in the domestic politics as we're seeing in Europe as the Ukraine invasion, Russia's invasion of Ukraine continues, with willingness to support and defend principles versus prices at the gas pump and heating bills and the like. Max, I just wanted to get your perspective on this as well, both from the business and the foreign policy side. What your take is on this discussion of transactionalism?
Sure. I'll try to pick up on some of the points Karthik made before taking it towards my opinions about where this is going and headed, and how we should be thinking about this policy going forward. For me, also this discussion of transactionalism as a foreign policy strategy tool is really nothing new. And I would say that certainly the nakedness with which the Trump administration pursued it, both in relation potentially to some of their own familial interests, but also in what they saw as the U.S. national interest, really made it a new conversation, because it was such a shift away from the argument of this the U.S.'s foreign policy is based in values and is upholding this rules-based order. And I would have to say personally, I certainly take the view that the rules-based order only ever existed as a result of the expression of the U.S.'s preferred preferences for the international economic structures, right? So the rules-based order never really existed with regards to the ideas of, sovereign inviolability or waging wars under, only UN authorization. Certainly the US-led invasion of Iraq in 2003, I think, is a prime example of that. And there's a lot of, very interesting components around it, not only how the US ignored the United Nations and went in without that authorization, but then also restructured large portions of the Iraqi economy and intervened there. But the rules overall of the international order as they do exist and as they are discussed are a reflection of their creation in the post-World War II and then Bretton Woods and post-1971, post-Bretton Woods era, where they have really come to be shaped very heavily by what was in the U.S. interest. So that ranges from the rules of how international debts are restructured amongst countries and the preferred creditor status and important roles of institutions like the IMF and World Bank, which while being United Nations institutions, are notably headed in Washington, D.C., not in Geneva or New York or Vienna like other UN institutions. And I think reflect a lot of the U.S.'s preferred policy positions there, the so-called Washington consensus of the past, to other areas of the international structure, whether it be through the WTO, for example, and the preferences there. Not all of those worked out entirely in the U.S. favor. In particular, that's a very heated conversation around the World Trade Organization, in particular, and China's entrance to it. And Trump's own criticisms of that basically came from saying, hey, we didn't get enough for Washington in NAFTA or in the WTO. But, for me, the fundamental issue really comes down to thinking that these rules are based on some kind of inherent principles rather than what's purely in the U.S. interest or not. And I think that, sort of the malleability of that got shown in some of the Abraham Accords, where leaving Trump's familial relations and Jared Kushner's property and investment portfolio aside, one of the most interesting ones to me from a sort of transactional basis was the Abraham Accord, not with the UAE, which, of course, economically and geopolitically much more significant, but between Israel, the United States, and Morocco. All the way on the western end of North Africa, in which Morocco also agreed to normalize relations with Israel and to recognize it. The Trump administration simultaneously, was moving to its expanded treatment of Israel, including the recognition of the Golan Heights as Israeli sovereign territory rather than Syrian sovereign territory. But also as part of this agreement, Washington recognized Morocco's claim to the Western Sahara. And this is something the Biden administration has not overturned, although they haven't necessarily given it much attention. And the future status of the Western Sahara, which for any listeners who are unfamiliar, is the reason in southwestern Morocco for almost 50 years now has had a independence movement led by a group called the Polisario Front, who today are primarily based just over the border in Algeria, only control a small sliver of that territory, but who do not wish to be under Moroccan sovereignty. But Morocco has never instituted the UN-backed referendum that used to be the U.S.'s position on the future of this conflict for a long time. Now, the Western Sahara is an obscure conflict that isn't necessarily on the forefront of policymakers' minds today or even then. But how this recognition occurred does have important recognitions for other examples of disputed sovereignty. So whether that be Russia's claim to annex territory in Ukraine, or in particular the territorial disputes between Serbia and Kosovo, or Georgia and the Russian-backed breakaway regions there of Abkhazia and South Ossetia, or even Taiwan and China. I think in some ways it's important to understand, one, that the U.S. was willing to do this despite it going against the past values to the administration's maintenance of that, but secondly, the real lack of ramification that it's actually had on any of those other conflicts. Even Putin, who's very keen to talk about the Kosovo precedent, which he claims the U.S.'s recognition of Kosovo, he claims was done outside of international law and gave Russia the right to recognize the breakaway states in Georgia and then the so-called People's Republics of Donetsk and Luhansk, which he now subsequently claims to have annexed. But really showed to me that one, the U.S. could essentially itself change its views on this rules-based order without any real significant costs to it, at least in certain issues. But secondly, with regards to the Biden administration's potential continuation of these policies and the future for it going forward, I think that really the question comes down to looking at whether transactionalism and where it fits into that policy interest. And Karthik's sort of description of these four interest groups is I think, particularly insightful in understanding how it affects U.S. policy domestically and how interests go there. But I also think there is a large school of thought already on this policy and how those interests can be balanced going forward. For which I really have to give credit to the academic Eric Helleiner, who's written a number of books on what he calls neo-mercantilism, which is sort of his framework for the ideas of Liszt and a number of other thinkers going back to the 19th century about how states could use what we now call geoeconomic tools, but also seek to promote their own domestic economic interests through their foreign policy and keep that as part of the balance there. And so the reality is yes, the Western Sahara, for example, in Morocco, grows lots of tomatoes that are exported to Europe. It's an important issue in trade agreements between the European Union and Morocco, playing a very big role in current discussions between Spain and France, which take opposite positions on this. But really, the economic interest there for the U.S. Isn't so significant. But there are other examples where we are able to really use those transactional economic tools and have in the past, whether that be in trade agreements or in loans, or even a potential recent example that we've just seen, which is after Erdogan gave his blessing earlier this summer or in the autumn Sweden joining NATO as well, the World Bank immediately came out and said we're considering expanding our loan book from $15 billion in Turkey to $30 billion. Now, I haven't been told directly that those two were linked, but I certainly believe they are. And secondly, I don't believe it's a bad thing that they are. I think our willingness to use tools of economic foreign policy in particular has grown tremendously in recent decades. Dan Dresner, others have done fabulous work on this with regards to sanctions in particular. But because the United States has this, relatively unique position, a lot of it is focused around sticks rather than carrots. And so where I'm particularly interested in going forward is how can we use carrots to advance the U.S. national interest, as well as some of those occasional questions of the international order. I don't claim that it's inherently based in rules. My view is that really a lot more of it falls from the economic matters. But those rules and those values, to bastardize, pardon my French, Lord Palmerston's famous phrase, nations only have permanent interests. I do think that our values can reflect our permanent interests in certain cases, but we're kidding ourselves and sometimes making foreign policy more difficult by claiming that they're inherently based in rules. But that's an easier way to talk to the world. I think that was very important when the U.S. was a unipolar, real hegemon in the 90s, and wanted to at least everybody to feel that they weren't sort of being dominated. Now that there's competition, I think there's an argument that those rules are overall better for anyone else, but that certainly acknowledging the economic interests they come from and considering using carrots as well as sticks is going to be really important for shaping how this is part of U.S. foreign policy going forward.
So based on that, I want, and Max, sorry for not mentioning earlier, we mentioned Karthik's article, but obviously you just published a major work on this in Economic War, and that, as you said, economic tools become much more critical. Access to finance, access to capital, the ability to use the dollar, to list companies on U.S. exchanges, to have access to U.S. technologies, the power of secondary sanctions where the U.S. still has enough heft where it can cause third parties to consider whether ties with someone else are worth the ties they have with the United States, economically speaking. And so building on that and going to both of you as we're looking at transactionalism, the sense that transactionalism, in order to work, the delivery question, that is to be able to deliver what you say you're going to do as part of this. So, Max, I'm intrigued by, as you said, right, we have this coincidental appearance about Turkey moving ahead with Swedish secession to NATO, IMF reconsidering some of what it's planning to do. That's probably murkier, but what about in cases where there is a sense that if you do X, Y, or Z, the U.S. will be prepared to do A, B, and C, but as we've sometimes seen, the Congress can interfere with that because of domestic interests or the like. So as we're looking at this question of transactionalism, we're looking at this question of economic tools, we're looking at the carrots and sticks that the U.S. deploys. Where do we bring in the question of credibility, so to speak, of deliverability in transactionalism? And does the U.S. have a problem in this regard, especially vis-a-vis certainly China, but some of the other players out there that may be more able to deliver what they promise because they don't have complicated domestic politics that may interfere. I mean, in the case of Morocco, I thought that was a fascinating point. We don't have a large lobby group of Moroccan Americans in one sense. We don't have a large diaspora, Western Saharan diaspora. We don't really have a number of interests there. But in other cases, how does the ability to deliver on a transactional approach, how important is that?
Sure. I'll jump in before passing over to Karthik. I think the credibility question is a really, really important one for a lot of and at this stage really needs to shape how we think about making this kind of policy and the kind of carrots and sticks, but in particular carrots that can be offered. I think American capital right now has real credibility with dealing with the U.S. on anything that needs to directly get through Congress. The gridlock that we should support for Ukraine or even Israel, which is not missed in these areas. That being said, we do have an executive presidency that has significant authorities to be able to make agreements and engage in these kind of transactions, right? The Senate in particular has a reserved role for overseeing treaties. And in the last decade, in particular with regard to Russia policy, we've seen a lot of direction come from Congress, famously in 2017 with the CATSA, Countering America's Adversaries Through Sanctions Act, that really enshrined those into U.S. law. As well as other sort of issues that become a rider as well. So with Turkey in particular, in the NDAAs, the National Defense Authorization Act often comes up around Turkey's status and fighter jet programs directly connected to these. So what tools get complicated by Congress has to be a consideration in making this policy going forward. And we have laws on the books now in particular that pertain to Xinjiang in China and Chinese treatment of workers there, as well as human rights standards and issues with the Uyghurs more largely, that will make it very difficult for any president to go and say, as part of X, Y, or Z agreement with Beijing, that there will be a change in how the U.S. approaches trade with Xinjiang. But in particular, I think the U.S. has this global institutional role that no other power has through the hegemony and the institutional frameworks that were built up over the last 40 years. And on the economy in particular, Henry Farrell and Newman's work on choke points in the U.S. is oversight of economic choke points, whether that be from money clearance to the secondary sanctions power of sanctions. That the executive really dominates a lot of those things, and we certainly have seen many agreements at a presidential level in the past when the U.S. agrees to provide some kinds of carrots in relation to other countries. So I think it really has to be shaped. In terms of those questions about credibility, we can get over some of them, but understand that it does limit the policy toolkit that exists at present. But that policy toolkit is also so large and so broad that no other country really compares to it. China, yes, can offer access to certain markets, can offer imports to other countries, but no country can control access to the U.S. market in the same way, and the U.S. executive has a lot of insight over that. So I'm worried about U.S. credibility questions more broadly with regards to transactionalism. For now, I think they limit some of the tools that can be on offer, but certainly don't make it an impossibility. What I would say is, because of our system of elections and our polarization, there then does end up being questions about commitment from one administration to another. We haven't seen that be such a big issue with the Biden administration, but potentially could be a much bigger issue if there is a second Trump administration. For example, if he were to make some kind of agreement with Putin and there were to be a second war, or further to the war, a future administration probably wouldn't be felt bound by that. But I'll pass over to Karthik now.
Thanks, Max. Yeah, I mean, my general, just to kind of pull back a little bit. I think the U.S. ability to use carrots that are based on market access to the United States are politically more problematic than the U.S. ability to use economic carrots that result from things being produced in the United States. It's very easy to tell Turkey you get to have F-35s because they're made here. So it's kind of a win-win on it's a win-win on both counts. I mean, there's some portion of them is made in Turkey, but it's basically export promotion is easy because you're taking off both domestic interest and a foreign policy interest. Conversely, the fate of TPP suggests that carrots that involve market access into the United States do have, may have bigger issues. And IPF, by the accounts of people I respect enormously, like Alan Beatty, the trade columnist for the FT, is seen as, an extraordinarily diluted version of TPP, for example. And because Alan hates homeopathy, I think of it as the homeopathic version of TPP. But I mean that's one set of constraints. Another, I think, is almost a paradox in that what the United States has going for it as a global power and has had for most of the last century is the fact that it is functionally much more resource efficient than any competitor, certainly more than China and much more and any European power that tried to do the same. Now, this is an enormous strength, but it also might limit the ability to use market access as a carrot just physiologically. And one place I see this play out is in Latin America, for instance, because the economies of South America seem much more naturally complementary with those of China than with those of the United States, or even more the extended NAFTA community. So now, I mean, I see people talking about how we need to do things in order to make, South America more closely tied to the Western Bloc, and I'm like, why would you? The U.S. is essentially energy sufficient and agriculture sufficient. There's the EU is clearly not energy sufficient, but agriculturally, it largely is, and it's going to get even more so if Ukraine becomes if Ukraine becomes a member. So there's China at the same time is also has this extraordinary capacity to build out logistics infrastructure at scale very fast and do it cheap. So when I see things like the U.S. having a freak out because China is offering to build a deep water port in Peru, it's the largest trading partner, and they do this all the time. What's the point? There's really no carrot that can compete with the Chinese 1-2 over there. So I wouldn't get too carried away with this idea that we need to reshape trade in accordance with, either geopolitically or with regime type, because I'm not even that sure that regime type is necessarily that much a driving force behind the new geoeconomic tussles. The other thing I want to mention, and this is about, I think the U.S. has significantly greater ability to use sticks, because sticks are kind of relatively cost-free. Or at least some sticks are relatively cost-free in the U.S., particularly sanctions, secondary sanctions. And to me, an interesting question here is I've never, I heard another podcast that Max did recently with Nikolas. I forgot his last name. I thought it was really fascinating.
Oh, Menon.
Yeah, and that was really interesting. It makes the point that actually, France has been sanctioned more by allies than by enemies. Which and I remember the BNP sanctions, which is one of the reasons that I had a small role in making the weaponization of finance in one of Eurasia Group's top risks in 2015, precisely coming out of the BNP sanctions. But the bigger point here is that China is clearly not a competitor. The renminbi is not ready for prime time. The euro has always been closer. But one of the issues with Europe is its internal architecture has meant that the European banking system is vastly more internationalized than its currency is, which is one of the reasons it is so vulnerable to secondary sanctions, because European banks are key players in global dollar intermediation, even more than US banks are, in fact. Now, I kind of know this because if you're in the market, it's like every emerging markets crisis is littered with the corpse of at least one Landesbank that ended up lending dollars somewhere in the world where it shouldn't have.
You could say,
So, and one of the things that Russia-Ukraine has done is it has, on the one hand, during the COVID crisis, it seemed to make the EU somewhat more ready to have its currency be a competitor because you had seen greater, some incipient steps towards greater mutualization, both through direct fiscal channels and through monetary channels by ECB backstops, which may have made the euro a marginally more interesting contender, at least over the next few years. And my view had always been that the rule, I've never believed in dollar replacement. I've thought of creeping regional displacement as the most likely outcome. And what I thought was it would happen via the Euroization of the energy trade between Europe and Russia that potentially brings Turkey in. And that might have been an interesting way for the dollar to have kind of more competition. But February 2020, and in Max's book, he talks about everything that happened between 2014 and 2022, where the Germans kept proceeding with, or seemed to keep proceeding with, something like this idea through the Nord Stream pipeline and so on that the US was freaking out about. What's changed since the invasion is that the transatlantic relationship has gotten significantly closer. So the EU is now a bigger part, not just of a kind of transatlantic financial system in ways that it might have drifted apart earlier, and might have been able to levy its own carrots and sticks had the process that started with COVID continued. Curious what you make of that, Max and Nick, because these are really more
I really want to touch particularly on that point about Europe and the relationship there, because this is where I think it's important that we do use a transactional or mercantilist framework to better understand policy as it exists now, and gets to, I think, some of the Trump administration's failures with these ideas, which Trump really made a lot of noise about. The need for European countries to reach 2% of GDP on defense spending as part of their NATO commitments. And he said, it's been reported today, apparently, that he said that the US wouldn't come to Europe's defense despite the NATO's commitments because of this to senior European officials. But particularly these dollar and euro questions, which are complicated. So I won't go totally into them, but certainly if listeners are interested, we can discuss them more in the Q&A. But what I would say is there already is a transactional relationship between the US and Europe with regards to defense and with regards to this dollar and euro block. So yes, the euro has lots of challenges. Development of COVID bonds was good, but hasn't gone far enough to internationalize it. Europe did internationalize the euro dollar and create that structure there. But really, the euro is the only currency over the last 70 years that has developed and internationalized and could be a competitor to the dollar. And secondly, it's also a large deficit market like the US is. So, building off Michael Pettis and some of Brad Setzer's work about the international structure. The reason why I don't worry about sort of BRICS as a competitor is these are, largely surplus countries, some of the largest surplus countries in the world. They need deficit markets in which to export their savings. Really, the only two large enough in the world are the United States and the European Union. Or Europe more broadly. The UK obviously is left, but it's still a deficit market that contributes on that side. So the for any other currency to replace the dollar, whether it be the euro or another future construct, it need a deficit market on sort of the allies of those in the anti-dollar side. Europe does trade entirely amongst itself within about 90+% in euro terms. but internationally is still a dollar user, still adheres to the potential costs from loss of access. So, we saw lots of European complaints about the Trump administration's unilateral withdrawal from the JCPOA, the agreement with Iran, but no ultimate sort of efforts to really, disrupt that or throw that over. And for me, we do that transactional relationship that exists between the United States with Europe is as follows: is the European Union gets a secure, and Europe more broadly gets a security guarantee from the United States, and in exchange they support and are active members of the global dollar bloc from which the U.S. derives so much of its power, and in my view, certainly derives more of its geopolitical power than even its military spending. And so if every European country gets to 2% of GDP spending on defense, I don't have the number in front of me right now, but it's something like, if the U.S. were to cut defense spending by something around 15%, all of those gains would, be entirely gone. The idea that European defense spending getting to 2% will make an actual difference in the ability of the West to defend Europe in a future conflict, unless it grows tremendously well past that, or the U.S. repositions itself, I think is a fantasy. So we have this transactional relationship with Europe already, but because we failed to understand it or view it as such, both on the Trump side or on the Democrat and establishment foreign policy side, certainly, amongst establishment Republican circles as well, it has limited our ability to discuss these issues with Europe, and I think hindered effective policy. And so by understanding the existing transactional nature of that relationship and how it can be tweaked is a far better model, I think, going forward than making those kinds of demands that are based on a fundamental misunderstanding of what that transactional relationship already is.
Thank you guys so much. I wanted to jump in here because Nick has asked me to help out with the audience Q&A, but this has really been a fantastic conversation. And I think, just as a quick comment, I think I think this bleeds into one of the questions here is that, what I see in what you guys are discussing is that, there isn't necessarily a contradiction between transactionalism and values, but that it's how you see one serving the other, really, and how tools that are maybe less used in the foreign policy toolkit, as Max pointed out, could be better utilized to sort of adhere and enforce and implement a more values-based foreign policy, in ways we haven't really thought of or considered yet. So we have a few questions in the chat. I'll read one of them out and kind of pitch it to both of you and see what you guys think. So we have a question here from Joni Carley. Interesting to hear values and interests being framed as an either or when data is clear that values fulfillment and values development unequivocally serves best interests of populations. Could the problems with transactionalism be the delusion that our values are something other than our interests? When common values are not being met or even tracked, doesn't that necessarily mean that common interests are not being met? If values are not measured, how do we know whose interests are prevailing in any given transaction and why? Either of you want to take those provocations up?
Go ahead.
Okay. Yes, certainly. I think values derive from interests, and that is certainly my view. I'm very much open to criticism and being challenged on it. But I think it is in the U.S.'s interest as the primary geopolitical power to at least advocate for some kind of rules-based and values-based standards without trying to pretend that we live in a world in which they are going to be determinate, right? And of course, values are relatively subjective compared to at least the purest interest, right? The purest interest, should this get sold to the United States at a cheaper price than it is sold now? Often we forget to think about the second and secondary and tertiary impacts thereof, but it's a pretty easy deal. Or what Trump was going and doing. I mean, he was lying because there were MOUs that didn't turn into contracts. But when he turned up in Saudi Arabia, in his first foreign visit, he said, "Look, I've got 150 billion in MOUs, most of which didn't." But so he was very much able to say, look, our interest is to sell more. In my opinion, that's a good example because there is a real question about whether selling more weapons to Saudi Arabia, which of course has been heavily involved in the conflict in Yemen, was in the U.S. interest and led to the destabilization there. The Houthis are in charge, with the Saudis had tried to resist anyway. So Saudi foreign policy wasn't ultimately that successful either. But for me, that sort of non-interference principle and claiming that Saudi Arabia shouldn't have done that in the first place and that we should have had a better argument of upholding that, would that have actually led to any impact on Vladimir Putin's decision-making to go into Ukraine? No. Would that have led to the global South more broadly and some of the countries discussed in this Transactional 25 taking some of these questions more seriously around their own support for Ukraine? Possibly. I mean, those that were really sort of at the margins and did come online, whether it be Singapore, which has had its own disputes with its neighbor Malaysia in the past, or South Korea, which is already a Western adjacent country. I'm not so sure it would have really expanded that effort there if we had been more forthright in upholding the value of that relationship with Saudi Arabia. I think a much better transaction with Saudi Arabia is something that is and disincentivized in the reported murder of Jamal Khashoggi in the Saudi consulate in Istanbul in 2018. I do think those would have been more effective. Where I worry about putting values too much ahead of pure interest and direct transactionalism is again from that example. The very next day after Mohammed bin Salman had those meetings with Trump in his foreign visit, he went to Russia, and that's where a lot of the key groundwork was done for formalizing OPEC Plus. That they put together, which I do think is a transactional relationship between non-values based countries that don't base their foreign policy in values, that has had real impacts for the United States, and really is something that most Americans feel at the pump directly, far more than any of these issues around sovereignty and principle and the like. And then that in turn has economic implications, political implications, right? How that relationship plays out and how the oil price at the pump shapes over the next year is probably going to have a more determinant impact on the U.S. election in November than the state of the battlefield in Ukraine itself. So one thing that we have to keep in mind when doing these is, yes, values are important, but also we are the United States is a democratically responsive country in which these tools can be used to affect the political environment within the United States itself in a way that Vladimir Putin's result in the election in Russia on the 17th of March, there's no level of sanctions or China even turning into criticizing Russia or Saudi Arabia breaking OPEC Plus, for example. None of that would determine whether the Kremlin says Putin gets 80% or 90%, right? That's a decision they're going to make domestically, and their foreign policy will not be shaped by that because they are not responsive to the will of their voters. So, I certainly, don't criticize the importance of the values that the U.S. as it proclaims, but I think if we put them before the interests, sometimes that we then end up putting the cart before the horse, and that in the long run that can have negative ramifications both for our interests and for our values.
Great, yeah, Karthik, go ahead.
No, just very quickly. I mean, I think ideologically, I'm what I call a do commerce, a sweet commerce guy, which means I believe that there is a possibility to find shared interests across countries, and to have. And one of the things that economic entanglement does is obviously it makes. It creates greater difficulties in terms of the use of both carrots and sticks, but it also creates greater shared interests. So, I think it's possible to find ways where you have countries that can identify both interests that are shared, that believe that and not all values are necessarily contradictory with each other. Clearly, regime type is a contradictory value between the US and some of its rivals, though it has not precluded alliances by the US or by other countries with, think of the US relationship with Vietnam, a Leninist capitalist country versus, and that with China. So I wouldn't go too far, but I think within that context, it should be possible. I think something like, things like global warming, things like, just basically increasing living standards for poor people around the world is potentially a shared value and a shared interest, even across rivalries. So this is, I guess this puts me in the John Kerry camp of the administration, but, there's at least one hopeful part. There's at least one hopeful bit here.
Yeah. I think we have time for one more question if we can answer it relatively quickly. And I'm going to read it off. This is from Ben Pribitok. And he says that granted that transactionalism is a useful instrument or adjunct to foreign policy, but isn't it also an intrinsically slippery slope ethically, whereas private interests become melded to a very large degree into public policy? It seems to me that this is not just a problem posed by a past or future Trump administration. Then there's the problem of engaging in expressly illegal activities. An example, he says, as has been alleged, flying opium for the Shan army, etc. So maybe a question about sort of coming back to where we started a little bit on transactionalism and individual private interests within government. I personally certainly agree that this could be a problem and maybe is a problem already, not only in the United States foreign policy, but we see this happening in presidential families across the globe. So Karthik or Max, you have something quick to add onto this?
I just say that in the structure of national politics, which is, there's kind of one extreme is purely personal interest. That's, let's put President Mobutu at one extreme of that, perhaps not fairly. There might be others, but he's probably the most prominent one. The other is the set of institutional compromises within an economy, because we recognize the concept of interest groups. One of the things that democracies do is they balance interest groups and through electoral mechanisms, but other countries have ways of doing the same thing through different kinds of institutional mechanisms. But we recognize that it's just a factor of domestic politics that you have interest groups, some of whose interests will spill over and get spilled back from foreign policy agendas. So, I tend to think this latter is physiological. The first is problematic, is how I would see it.
Max, closing thought on personalism and transactionalism and the slippery slope possibly that exists?
I think there is undoubtedly a slippery slope that exists. Power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. In terms of thinking about these things, I do admit that ultimately, I think a world in which these policies help the U.S. retain its position as the leading geopolitical power are sometimes worth some of that potential cost, because I think the world is overall in a better place with the United States as the leading power. And without it, what I would say is, enforcing that and making sure it doesn't become an issue is really a question for domestic policy and our rule of law and some of the challenges that we're seeing right now. I think certainly these questions are relevant about precisely why there shouldn't be immunity for presidential actions and potential corruption. We need better ways of investigating that, holding it to account, and ensuring it doesn't happen. And in particular, it's not just on the presidential level, right? A lot of this really comes down to the Washington level and the revolving door that does exist between lobbying in particular and political life. So I view this, to make one last transactionalism example. for me, the promotion of the dollar and the use of the dollar system is one of the foremost parts of U.S. geopolitical power, and it's the core of our interest and something we should be doing to promote. I don't think we always have the best understanding of that, and that's certainly something that I try to contribute to with my research in FPRI. At the same time, don't believe that cryptocurrencies are a real strategic threat to this, but certainly the advocates of cryptocurrencies do believe that, right? Advocates of cryptocurrencies go out and talk about these matters all the time. And, leaving aside dodgy deals between 666 Park Avenue or, Burisma and Hunter Biden in Ukraine, the fact that, almost every senator who's retired in the last few years has gone on to become some form of a crypto lobbyist, I think is ridiculous. Frankly, if the Bitcoin fanatics who say that, we should replace the dollar with this currency that doesn't even have a credit function attached to it, so would be devastating for global lending markets, as well as the U.S.'s ability to use some of these sticks in terms of sanctions. I mean, that is just to me blatantly against the U.S. National interest. So we need to have that conversation domestically about how those things work, but I don't think that should preclude us from saying transactionalism, which as we established in the beginning, this is nothing new, needs a revisit and a rebrand and a refresh to understand how it can be most effective.
Well, thank you for that, Max, and certainly, yeah, I buy this idea that the crypto is potentially a cleaner form of corrupted transactionalism than, say, I don't know, gold bars or cars, as we've seen in the U.S. Senate more recently along this line. But
it's harder to draw directly, but yes, the gold bars are definitely an
issue. Anyway, look, this has been a fantastic conversation. I want to thank you, Karthik, Max, and Nick for picking this up. And I hope there's this really generative discussion. I hope we can pick up the threads in a future event or research product here at FPRI. Once more to the audience, thank you for joining us. You should have gotten a link in the chat to a feedback form. Please fill that out. We do pay close attention to those. Helps us guide our way through curating future events. And one last thank you to everyone on the call today who has been a supporter of FPRI in one form or another over the years. And again, for those of you who have not yet been a supporter of ours, please consider it. And lastly, if you missed any part of this, please check our YouTube page within a day. It'll be up there. You can catch the whole conversation if you missed any part of it. So thank you all very much, and have a great rest of the day.